The smarter you try to control your wealth, the less you'll keep. Most people will hear that and immediately disagree, because everything modern financial culture teaches points in the opposite direction. But King Solomon, the wealthiest sovereign in ancient record, built and preserved wealth not through tighter oversight, but through a principle of structured release that most people have never been taught. The mechanism exists in plain text, in one of the most widely read books in human history, and it has been quietly overlooked for generations. Wealth is not a number you monitor. It is a structure you maintain. If this challenges what you believe about money, stay until the end. The smarter you try to control your wealth, the less you'll keep. Sit with that for a moment. Don't move past it. Because everything you've been told about money, the tracking, the planning, the obsessive oversight may be the very thing quietly working against you. This is not a warning about spending. It is not about budgets or interest rates. What you're about to hear is something older, something that predates every financial system currently in use. A principle so counterintuitive that most people will reject it before they fully understand it. And that rejection is precisely why most people will never build wealth that lasts. Picture someone you may recognize. A salaried worker earns a reasonable income, checks his accounts every morning before work, reviews his portfolio twice a week, adjusts, reallocates, monitors. He has spreadsheets organized by color, alerts set on his phone. He reads every article, every update, every market signal. He is, by every modern definition, responsible. And yet, year after year, the number barely moves. He is not lazy, he is not unintelligent. He is doing exactly what the modern world told him to do. Control everything, oversee everything, stay vigilant. And it is costing him more than he knows. Not in obvious ways, not in a single catastrophic loss, but in the slow erosion that comes from constantly touching what should be left to grow. In the opportunities bypassed because his attention was divided across 10 spreadsheets instead of one principle. In the compounding potential lost to restlessness. This is the modern wealth illusion. The belief that more control equals more security. That the closer you watch, the more you accumulate. That busyness is a form of protection. It is not. Busyness is noise dressed as discipline. And somewhere beneath that noise, there exists a completely different framework. One that has been operating quietly for centuries. One that does not appear in financial news or investment seminars. One that certain families have passed down, not as a strategy, but as an identity. There is a book in ancient scripture that most people have heard of, but very few have studied for its economic architecture. The Book of Proverbs. Attributed largely to King Solomon, a figure historically recognized not merely for spiritual wisdom, but for the accumulation and stewardship of generational wealth on a scale that most modern economists struggle to contextualize. Solomon did not inherit a financial institution, he inherited a principle. Proverbs 11, verses 24 and 25 reads, "One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed." Read that slowly. Not through a religious lens, through a structural one. What Solomon is describing is not charity in the conventional sense. He is describing the mechanics of flow, the principle that resources held in rigid, fearful containment stagnate and resources allocated with structure and discipline circulate, compound, and return. This is not metaphor. This is a wealth architecture that the ancient Hebrew world embedded into daily life. The practice of tithing, setting aside 1/10, was not simply a spiritual obligation. It was a structured allocation discipline that prevented accumulation from becoming attachment. It enforced the cycle. It trained the holder of wealth to remain a steward rather than an owner. Consumed by fear of loss, the observance of Shabbat, one full day of economic rest each week, was not passivity. It was a built-in mechanism that forced cessation of micromanagement, a structural pause that prevented the constant interference which erodes both resources and clarity. These were not suggestions, they were laws, and they produced families whose wealth survived not one generation, but many. The principle governing all of it has a name. These principles are centuries old, and yet they are almost entirely unnoticed today, not because they are hidden. They are in plain sight, in one of the most widely distributed texts in human history. They are unnoticed because they run contrary to every instinct modern financial culture reinforces. Modern culture says, watch closely. Ancient structure says, allocate and release. Modern culture says, optimize constantly. Ancient structure says, establish a cycle and trust it. Modern culture says, the more active you are, the more you earn. Ancient structure says, the more disciplined your restraint, the more you preserve. This is the assumption that must break before anything else makes sense. The assumption is this: the more control I maintain, the safer I am. It feels true. It feels rational. It is almost universally held, and it is one of the most costly beliefs a person can carry into their financial life. Here is what excessive control actually produces. It produces decision fatigue, the quiet depletion of judgment that comes from making too many small choices about money. It produces what behavioral economists have documented extensively: the tendency of hyperactive investors to consistently underperform passive, structured allocators over time. It produces anxiety, not security, not growth. Anxiety and the illusion of safety. Think about the micromanaging merchant in any era. The one who second-guesses every transaction, renegotiates every agreement, repositions every asset at the first sign of movement. He is exhausted, he is reactive. And the merchant across the city, the one operating from an established allocation structure, rarely adjusting, rarely in motion, quietly accumulates across decades. The difference is not intelligence, it is not access, it is not timing, it is structure, and it is restraint. Could restraint be the true power? The answer, once understood, does not leave you. The wealth mechanism at the center of what you're hearing is called the law of reserved flow. It operates on a deceptively simple premise. True wealth, the kind that persists, compounds, and transfers across generations, does not grow through constant interference. It grows through structured cycles of allocation, restraint, and release. Allocation, directing resources with deliberate purpose into defined categories. Restraint, resisting the impulse to constantly adjust, withdraw, or override the structure. Release, allowing resources to move through their designated channels without interference. This is not passive. Understand that clearly, this is an active, disciplined engagement with a system. The discipline is in the construction of the structure. Once built, the discipline is in not dismantling it every time fear or impatience signals. Ancient Hebrew families who sustained wealth across multiple generations through conquest, displacement, economic upheaval did not do so through aggressive accumulation strategies. They did so through the consistent observance of allocation rhythms. Principal reserves that were not touched. Portions designated for communal flow that were released on a fixed cycle. Opportunity funds that sat patient until conditions were clear. This is how certain families never go broke. Not luck, not inheritance alone, not superior intelligence. The law of reserved flow, quietly governing those who will never exhaust what they've built. Now here is the layer that requires a different kind of attention. Most people approach money as income, as a number, as a balance on a screen, and that framing money as number produces a very specific kind of behavior. It produces constant comparison, constant monitoring, constant judgment of the number against some imagined threshold. When the number is high, relief. When the number drops, fear. The emotional state is entirely dependent on the fluctuation of a figure. This is not wealth psychology. This is financial anxiety wearing the mask of financial management. Families who preserve wealth across generations do not relate to money this way. Their relationship with wealth is not defined by a balance. It is defined by a structure, by a set of behaviors they maintain regardless of what the number reads on any given day. Wealth, for them, is not something they have. It is something they are. It is encoded in how they allocate, in how long they wait, in what they refuse to touch, in what they release without emotional interference. This is the identity shift that changes everything. Your wealth will not obey your anxiety. It will not respond to your daily monitoring with increased growth. It will obey your discipline, your structure, your patient adherence to a cycle that operates beyond the noise of any single week or quarter. The person who checks their accounts every morning is not building wealth. They are rehearsing fear, and fear-based financial behavior produces fear-based financial outcomes. The person who establishes a structure reserves, flows, allocations, and then steps back from the impulse to constantly interfere is building something different. They are building a system that works, whether they are watching or not. And a system that works without your constant oversight is the beginning of real financial independence. Discipline outlasts desire. That phrase is not decoration. It is the operational reality of every family that has kept wealth intact across 2 or more generations. Not desire for more, not obsession with the number. Discipline over the structure. Generational wealth moves quietly. It does not announce itself. It does not perform. It does not require your daily emotional attention to keep functioning. And right now, beneath the surface of what you've just heard, there is a deeper layer to this mechanism, a structural element that determines not just whether wealth grows, but whether it survives the test that almost every generation eventually faces. That is where this goes next, and it changes the way you will think about time. Time is not neutral. Most people treat time as a backdrop to their financial decisions, a passive container in which money either grows or shrinks. They think in terms of what they can do within time, how quickly they can act, how rapidly they can accumulate, how soon they can see a return. But the ancient world understood something about time that modern financial culture has almost entirely abandoned. Time is not a backdrop. Time is the mechanism itself. Solomon's wisdom did not produce short-term results. It produced dynasties. The Hebrew principle of cyclical stewardship was not designed for quarterly performance. It was designed for generational endurance. And the distinction between those two orientations, quarterly performance versus generational endurance, is not a minor adjustment in thinking. It is a complete restructuring of what wealth means and how it behaves. Here is the deeper structural layer of the law of reserved flow. The first layer, as you heard, is the cycle itself. Allocate, restrain, release. That is the operating rhythm. But the second layer, the one that separates temporary accumulation from lasting wealth, is patience as a structural force. Not patience as a virtue. Not patience as a personality trait. Patience as a leverage mechanism. Consider this illustration. Two individuals receive the same amount of capital in the same year. The first moves constantly. He repositions quarterly. He responds to every signal. He takes profits early, re-enters late, adjusts allocations whenever confidence wavers. Over 10 years, he is active, informed, and perpetually busy with his money. The second establishes a structure in year 1. Principal reserve, untouched. Disciplined, flow allocation, automated, consistent. Opportunity reserved, patient, waiting for clarity rather than urgency. He reviews the structure twice a year. He does not interfere with the cycle between those reviews. After 10 years, the gap between these two individuals is not marginal. It is significant. Not because the second person was fortunate. Not because markets moved in his favor. But because time, applied to an undisturbed structure, compounds in ways that constant interference prevents. Time favors flow, not control. This is the hidden lever behind every family that has preserved wealth across a generation or more. They did not do more. They did less, with more structure. They allowed time to do what only time can do, and they had the discipline not to interrupt it. Now understand what this requires psychologically. Because the application is simple, the discipline is not. The discipline test is this: can you resist the impulse to overmanage what is already allocated correctly? This is harder than it sounds. Because financial fear is not rational. It does not respond to the logic of a sound structure. It responds to fluctuation, to uncertainty, to the feeling that something might go wrong if you are not constantly watching. And that feeling, that low-level, persistent anxiety about what might happen if you step back, is the single greatest threat to the law of reserve flow. Not bad investments. Not market conditions. Not economic downturns. Those are external forces. They exist for everyone equally. The threat that is unique to each individual is internal. It is the impulse to dismantle a working structure because discomfort demands action. A family in ancient commerce did not renegotiate their allocation principles every time a season was poor. Their structure was designed to absorb poor seasons. The reserve existed precisely for adversity. The flow continued precisely because it was not contingent on perfect conditions. The patience held precisely because the structure had been built for time, not for immediate performance. Your actions must serve the law, not your panic. When the structure is sound, interference is the risk, not an action, and recognizing that, truly internalizing it, is the psychological rewire that separates those who accumulate from those who preserve. There is a contrast worth observing here. A quiet one. Walk through any environment where wealth is loudly displayed, the performance of acquisition, the visible symbols of financial status, and what you are witnessing is rarely generational wealth. It is recent wealth, wealth that has not yet been tested by time. Wealth that is performing because it does not yet know how to simply exist. Generational wealth does not perform. It does not require an audience. The families who have quietly influenced commerce, shaped institutions, and sustained prosperity across decades are not the ones filling visible space with evidence of their position. Silence is not absence. Silence is strategy. Proverbs does not describe wealth as spectacle. It describes it as fruit. Something that grows slowly, that requires seasons, that does not announce its development daily, and that arrives in its own time regardless of whether anyone was watching. Noise is the enemy of flow. This is not a philosophical suggestion, it is an observable pattern. The individuals who talk most about what they are building, who require external validation of their financial identity, who perform prosperity rather than practice it, these individuals are almost without exception, trading long-term structure for short-term recognition, and short-term recognition compounds into nothing. Generational wealth moves quietly. Silent wealth grows unobserved. These are not poetic phrases. They are behavioral descriptions of how lasting wealth actually operates. There is a cultural pressure that must be addressed directly. It does not deserve dramatic confrontation, but it does deserve clarity. The current era has produced an obsession with accelerated effort, side operations stacked on primary income, stacked on digital ventures, stacked on perpetual optimization, constant activity framed as virtue. exhaustion worn as a badge of seriousness. This is not discipline. This is friction, wearing the appearance of productivity. The law of reserved flow does not oppose work, it reframes the purpose of work. Work generates the resource. Structure governs the resource. Patience compounds the resource. These are three distinct phases, and confusing them, treating work as the solution to all three, produces a specific outcome. An individual who earns consistently and builds nothing lasting because the resource never had the stability or the time to develop structure of its own. Effort without flow is friction. And friction, sustained long enough, burns through whatever it was meant to protect. The ancient merchant did not operate every hour of every day. He understood cycles. He understood that certain seasons were for activity and certain seasons were for restraint. That resource, like land, requires fallow periods to produce abundantly. That the farmer who plants in every season, who never allows the soil to rest, who extracts without replenishing, will eventually hold depleted ground. Structured patience surpasses hyperactivity. Every time, across every era, this brings everything to a single, practical convergence. If the law of reserved flow is the mechanism, and patience is its leverage, and silence is its natural environment, then what does implementation actually look like in daily life? It looks like this. You designate, with clarity and finality, 3 categories for every resource that enters your life. A principal has a bien touched, growing on its own cycle, never accessed for convenience or impulse. A disciplined flow, a consistent allocation toward what sustains and grows your life structure, automated where possible, reviewed periodically, not daily. An opportunity reserved patient capital, not deployed until conditions are clear, not moved by urgency or by the fear of missing something. These 3 categories are not equal in size. They are equal in importance, and the discipline is not in the initial designation. The initial designation is relatively simple. The discipline is in the maintenance of the boundary between categories. In refusing to borrow from the principal reserve because a short-term opportunity feels urgent. In refusing to redirect the flow allocation because a month was difficult. In refusing to deploy the opportunity reserve because waiting feels uncomfortable. Each morning, not an hour, not a review session, not a monitoring exercise, 10 minutes, a brief, structured reflection. Not on the numbers, on the alignment. Are your actions still consistent with the structure you established? Has something shifted that requires a genuine, considered adjustment, or is what you are feeling simply impatience, dressed as necessity? That distinction between genuine structural need and emotional interference is the daily practice. It is subtle, it is not dramatic. And over time, it rewires the relationship between your decisions and your money in a way that no spreadsheet, no tracking app, no market signal can replicate. You are not a manager of coins. You are a custodian of flow. That shift in identity from manager to custodian changes every financial decision that follows. A manager controls. A custodian maintains. A manager reacts. A custodian observes before acting. A manager measures performance daily. A custodian measures integrity of structure over years. Small, consistent acts cement generational advantage. Not large, dramatic moves. Not complex strategies. Small, consistent, disciplined adherence to the structure across time. One final observation, offered calmly. Impatience is not a flaw of character. It is a natural response to uncertainty. Every person who has ever built anything of lasting value has felt the pull of impatience. The desire to see results before the cycle has completed. The temptation to intervene before time has done its work. The difference between those who yield to it and those who do not is not willpower. It is identity. Those who have fully accepted that their wealth is an expression of their structure, not their activity, not their anxiety, not their constant surveillance, find that impatience has less authority over their decisions. Because they are not waiting for the number to confirm their worth. They are maintaining a practice that already reflects who they are. Wealth obeys patience, restraint, and discipline across generations, not across news cycles, not across quarters, across generations. He who grasps too tightly, lets all slip. Solomon understood this not as philosophy, but as operational reality. The hand that clutches cannot receive. The structure that is constantly dismantled cannot compound. The wealth that is perpetually supervised never develops the independence that makes it generational. The law of reserved flow is not complicated. It is ancient, it is proven, and it is entirely available to anyone willing to build the structure, and then practice the harder discipline of stepping back and allowing time to do what only time can do. Generational wealth moves quietly. Discipline outlasts desire. Observe before acting. Patience is the ultimate leverage. And silent wealth grows unobserved, for those with the structure to receive it and the identity to sustain it. The law of reserved flow, allocate, restrain, release, repeat across generations.